Thank you, Frank. And good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to talk to you today about accountability to affected populations. It's definitely a topic and issue that I have worked on personally for 5 years in response and development work. And it's also something that I'm the focal point for the M&E team for BHA on. So just to explain a little bit about why this is a newer session for RIFSAs, it has always been a component, but it hasn't been explicitly brought out in the M&E RIFSA policy and guidance. And so now we're putting a little bit more focus on it because as Legacy OFDA and Legacy FFP merged into what is now known as BHA, accountability for affected populations now has a home, an institutional home, and it sits within the M&E team, especially when we're looking at feedback mechanisms, data, and it sits also in our protection team when we're looking at accountability when it comes to inclusivity and making sure the most marginalized can access communication channels and that they're meaningfully participating. Next slide, please. So the session objectives today is really to understand accountability of affected populations. I think for some, it is a newer term. So we want to make sure that we're understanding the definition. And we're also sharing what BHA's expectations are on accountability to affected populations and the human-centric approach that we'd like to promote, and discuss partner approaches to AAP, because I know a lot of implementing partners have different ideas of the best way to operationalize it in the context they're working in. So it'd be interesting to hear from you as well, what maybe you would anticipate as key challenges and also good practices. It does somewhat require some thinking outside of the box at times. So this is not a rigid, system that we would expect. We would very much, be supportive of any innovative solutions, especially in the challenging context that we work in. I know most of the time we are doing this. We are conducting accountability to affected populations already, but we're maybe not calling it that. So we want to make sure that it's well understood and well emphasized. So why is, next slide please, why is AAP important? So really accountability is central to all of our work. It's what ensures that we are getting the appropriate quality assistance to the right people in a timely and efficient manner without causing harm, because sometimes we don't know that maybe one intervention is causing unintentional harm. But what it does is that feedback helps us identify that if it is. And so, in the nature of humanitarian work, it is ripe for accountability issues just because of the difficult environments we do work in. And I think that makes it even more important to get real-time feedback through these channels, and making sure that communication is always open and also that we're very responsive to those issues. So just to highlight, USAID and BHA and our partners are not only accountable to delivering program results to, ourselves and expressing what has been accomplished to US taxpayers, but especially to those affected by our programming, so those that we are serving. So next slide, please, just to make sure we're getting on the same page. Social accountability has been a topic that was discussed in the exception workshop, and I'm sure you all were there and remember that session, but just to emphasize the difference between social accountability and accountability to affected populations, here because they are quite different. So social accountability mechanisms really refers to a broad range of actions that citizens, communities, and civil society organizations can hold to government officials and other duty bearers accountable. And when it comes to accountability to affected populations, what we're really talking about is enabling affected populations to play an active role in decision making in processes that do affect them. So really ensuring that we establish clear guidelines and practices to make sure that they don't get lost from the central equation. And it's really important when we're thinking about setting up our feedback complaint mechanism that we think about the power dynamics and using those powers that we have or responsibilities that we have like very responsibly, and that we mitigate them, so we make sure that the people that we're serving feel comfortable coming to us. And that's about developing trust and having that two-way communication, having a feedback mechanism and responding to it and making sure that feedback loop is closed is all about developing trust, which will really enable better program quality. And so through accountability to affected populations, it's not only a right of our participants. It's rights based. They have a right to inform the process, but then also it is about improving our quality and making sure all of our programming is adapted to their needs. Next slide, please. So this slide is a little overwhelming, and it's not to give you an information overload. Its purpose is really to show why is accountability to affected populations being raised currently and how far it's come. It has truly been an evolution. Believe it or not, the human-centric approach in development work or humanitarian work has not always been on our radar. And so previously, we didn't really emphasize the need for feedback mechanisms, but we have found through all of these events that have happened. For example, in 1996, there was a joint evaluation in Rwanda that highlighted the participation of crisis-affected people and accountability as really core to improving the quality of humanitarian assistance. And now we kind of look at these at present day as like being such a finding that's like, of course, of course that would be the case. But back then it wasn't necessarily understood. And so where we're at now is really that, the core humanitarian standards 4 and 5 emphasize, how important accountability is, and through the communication of programming, through understanding how participants can feed into it and really get their feedback answered. And so this slide is just to show you how much it's evolved and become more sophisticated. Next slide, please. So collective accountability is something we talk about often, and that's something BHA is really trying to push forward, because in essence, collective approach is a response contracts-wide approach. So it really concerns the entire community of actors that are responding to the crisis. There's no perfect model of a collective approach, but it is often tailored to the needs and the context. But ultimately, what it really means is that these feedback mechanisms by implementing partners are also being coordinated and referred to one another as necessary and working in a collective way, so that if a participant does submit a piece of feedback to one implementing partner, they can be assured that it will get responded to and or referred to the right implementing partner. Next slide, please. So BHA expectations for accountability to affected populations is really outlined more in our emergency side, but is, now with the update of the RIFSA P&G comes out more clearly in on the RIFSA side. So how do the affected populations, including the most marginalized and vulnerable groups, how will they participate and play an active role in decisions related to them when it comes to the programming and implementation? And I think something important to note here is when we have an over-reliance on the feedback mechanisms, it usually does marginalize further because feedback mechanisms are oftentimes set up with phones or online. And, that really does in certain contexts, you leave out the most vulnerable. So we want to make sure that we have a variety of proactive feedback channels and also reactive. And so we want to ensure that the feedback and information mechanisms are safe, accessible, and also that we know through having asked what their preferred way of communication is, so we can set it up accordingly. And then, something that was raised as a question for this session is ensuring, that you have a confidential channel and that, the feedback submitted is safe. And there are protections in place for those who do submit sensitive feedback, ensuring that there's no fear of any repercussions. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by feedback mechanism? We mean that it's an effective way that supports the collection, acknowledgement, and analysis, and especially the response to feedback. So what's really important to judge if your feedback mechanism is effective is by whether or not you are able to process and handle all of the feedback coming in and complaints and making sure that that loop is closed. I would say, and it's quite a standard, that if the feedback loop isn't getting closed, then it's not a truly effective mechanism and it could hinder trust. So what we mean by closing the feedback loop, that means that an action has taken and a response to that action has been given. And it gets a little tricky, especially with anonymous feedback, but there are ways to close the feedback loop ideally with anonymous feedback. And it just takes a lot of thought to make sure that you develop standard operating procedures so you know in which scenario is the best course of action. And so, next slide, please. The common accountability to affected populations operational challenges we tend to see are especially the socialization of accountability to affected populations. And so the participants need to have a common understanding of what we understand as what is holding us accountable, right, to them. Sometimes accountability as a term doesn't translate well in the context we're working in. And so in that case scenario, it's really important to have socialization of accountability and really express and share what the community is that you're welcoming of feedback, and it will be answered, and what we tend to mean by complaints and that they are welcome and that will help us improve and that they would never hinder their receipt of services. There are often different expectations of understanding even on our side of what accountability is, what expectations and standardizations there should be. An example of this is complaint or feedback categories. Many implementing partners have different complaint or feedback categories. So sometimes it's hard to then aggregate. They also may have different referral processes. So that is an operational challenge as well. Resourcing your feedback and complaint mechanism is also really important and could be an operational challenge if not resourced appropriately. So thinking about how much of the budget should be going to the system that needs to be effective. Closing the feedback loop, as mentioned previously, face-to-face feedback is often not documented because it is in that, informal nature provided. But if it's improving the programming, it's really good to document that. So because it's, additional learning. Same with anonymous feedback. Using information for decision making. It's been really challenging for AAP to aggregate data and use it to identify trends and to link it to key decisions. I think this kind of is an overriding issue when it comes to satisfaction indicators as well. It's about understanding the context that the feedback is provided in and validating it. But also in many case scenarios, there's a lack of grievance redress mechanisms. And so if you also do not have a satisfactory closing out of your complaint or feedback, there is really nothing in place in certain contexts to go and make an appeal. Another operational challenge that we have is testing the functionality of your feedback response mechanism. How do you know that you're including the most marginalized and reaching those that may be young to be able to submit written feedback? It's all very much in, also language considerations need to be made. It's all really complex. And I think what we're trying to do, the expectation is that we're trying to reach these most marginalized and really putting in that it is an inclusive system. And then another key challenge that we have seen is poor quality programming tends to overwhelm feedback response mechanisms. This is because if there is not clear communication about the programming, beneficiaries and participants will often reach out through the feedback response mechanism, so much so that it's hard to process it all when really they're just asking for information on the programming. And so one way to mitigate that would be to have really good and ensure that you have great communication to communities about what your programming is. And we've seen that especially with some of the cash programming when you have perhaps some issues with the functionality of the debit card, they will call your feedback response mechanism to sort out the technical issues. And so we want to try to mitigate that challenge at all costs. And another one is that within your team, AAP could get lost because there are often more rigorously enforced M&E requirements. And so AAP is often deprioritized when really it's integral to the whole process, right? Our human-centric approach. So, I mean, it is a recommendation to have somebody who's really focused on the AAP to make sure that it doesn't get lost or overshadowed. And that we have somebody in the room who is reflecting the feedback of the population we're serving, as they don't often have that ability to be in the decision-making room. Next slide, please. So BHA feedback mechanism expectations, just continuing on that, we would like to know, how is your feedback mechanism collecting, monitoring, and addressing in a timely manner what you deem as a timely manner and what's possible in the context, the feedback being received? How are you incorporating beneficiary feedback throughout the activity and feeding it into performance monitoring? How are you sharing these monitoring results with beneficiaries? So closing that feedback loop again. And how is your feedback mechanism linked to whether there's a wider response or context, a wider context that it needs to be coordinated with. So whether there's a government mechanism or a cluster system in a response to make sure that there is a way to ensure that if a beneficiary does submit feedback to a mechanism and it's not the appropriate place for it, that it's appropriately referred and responded to. Another, aspect that we always like to know when it comes to beneficiary feedback and data is how the feedback is being categorized and aggregated, and what is the standard procedure for that. All of those aspects help BHA understand how accountable we're being. And so on the next slide, we have some key resources that when it comes to accountability to affected populations, there are so many tools and resources out there. And here I've included two web pages that I find are, the most holistic, comprehensive places to find those tools. And one is the Core Humanitarian Standards resource page, and another one is the Accountability Inclusion resource page on ALNAP, or by the Interagency Standing Committee. It has a portal and it's easily searchable for any of the tools that you may be looking for when it comes to setting up your accountability system. And so that's a lot of information, but I just wanted to pause there and see if you had any questions. Yes. So I will start the sharing of good examples, and I have two, and then I would love to hear any examples you would like to share, because I think this, helps us think of creative ways to incorporate into our mechanism to make sure that we're doing the utmost to create that trust and make sure that the feedback mechanism is really a two-way communication tool with the communities. So we had a DFAB in Niger, and that was an old term for what we now are calling RIFSAs. So that was with legacy FFP. And what they did was set up complaint committees. Well, they wouldn't call them complaint committees, but feedback committees, whatever would be appropriate, most appropriate for that, to foster that understanding with the community of what that was. And within those committees, they provided, the program provided cell phones that were free of credit to make sure that the committees could always reach them at any time. And they would show the logbooks of, what complaints and feedbacks were received, and ensuring that those committees had meaningful representation from different groups. So just wanted to share that one. And also, they had accountability officers that would go to the committees on a regular basis and talk with them. Also, not only to collect in-person feedback, but to collect any documented feedback. And I think this really kept that trust and, two-way communication open. And that was a really good example that I saw, especially because for those that, might be kind of inaccessible because of cell phones or for any financial reasons, since the program provided that continuity and phone credit and the phones itself, then it really just established, that permanent connection. And then in the response in Venezuela, there was an assessment done, and they realized that they had a lot of participants that were children. And so through that, they did a bit of a study to see what would be the most appropriate and preferred channel that children would like to submit their feedback, and whether it's, written because, they're younger, so they might not be able to, but they could draw or, express their thoughts on the programming through this box. And this box was created as an example here in the photo to really make sure it was at the height that children would, easily access it and in a friendly manner. And they even informed the design of it. And so this really, garnered a lot and led to a lot of child feedback that was super helpful for this particular organization because they were targeting that population. So I'll stop there and see if anyone else in the room would like to share any good examples they've seen. Is it a requirement to include the AAP data into the M&E plan? We request it, but it's not right now a formalized requirement. But so we're starting to look at AAP data utilization. And this usually comes from the M&E side, depending on how your AAP mechanism is set up. But usually, as I've seen it often, the M&E folks do process that AAP data. And so when we're looking at it now, and this is at the very beginning steps of how partners are reporting in their AAP data and how it could better inform our decision making, we look at it in three main buckets. And so low data utilization would be categorized as, reporting that is offering basic information on the AAP mechanism, just the mechanisms that are in set up. Like we have three mechanisms: one's a hotline, email, whatnot. But there's little beyond high-level descriptions of how that data was used, analyzed, and fed into the monitoring system, and also used to improve the program quality. Medium, we would categorize as there is some detail on accountability to affected populations, including how the feedback is received, during the reporting period. And there's a lower level of analysis. We're thinking number of feedbacks received or number of feedback received by women, men, and that's often something we get, but I think there is another step that's even higher that would be even more informative, which is more significant analysis as to how the feedback has resulted in program adaptations and how that really is resulting in improved program quality. And to say the output data is very important for us. It's good to know, that feedback is being received, that shows that your mechanism is working. That could also indicate that there may be an issue that we can, address through that. But I think, really what we're seeing currently across the board as a trend and reporting is this lower category of just the basic information that's repeating in the reporting of, this is how our mechanism is set up, when accountability is truly not just about how the mechanism is set up, but really about being adaptive and, responding to those feedbacks. So that's pretty much what I wanted to share with you. This is by no means a requirement at any point, but this is how we tend to read the AAP data that's provided in reporting currently. And so we can go to the final slide, please. Yeah, so here I just wanted to talk about some of the key approaches that we could share. So some of the proactive, reactive communication channels, responding to challenging feedback that may be out of scope for your RIFSA, anonymous, in person. How do you close the feedback loop? And in those case scenarios is quite difficult. And, it's also about empowering frontline staff workers to be able to understand how to respond to feedback and what they need to do to formally place it into the feedback mechanism, and best practices for course